Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, wood turning tools. So, I recently bought a lathe and I decided I would like to make all the tools for that lathe myself. Of course, I could go out and buy them, but very high quality wood turning tools are extremely expensive. So putting aside the expense though, I just enjoy making stuff. Now, as I see it, there are probably going to be two sets of folks who might be interested in this topic. One set are my usual guys who are interested in making knives, and the other set of guys are wood turners. And their skill sets and equipment and so forth are not always going to be the same. So I'm actually going to make a series of videos here. In each video, I'm going to make a different kind of wood turning tool, and I'm going to use different techniques in making it. So if you watch over the course of the full series of videos, hopefully you'll learn a bunch of different ways that you can heat treat and grind tools. And in so doing, if you don't have all the equipment that's necessary to do all these different kinds of tools that I'm making, you'll be able to find ones that fit your shop, your equipment, your skill level, and so forth. Okay, before I get started, let me give a super brief introduction to tool steel for those of you who may have never made a cutting tool before. The key concept we'll be addressing throughout these videos is the notion of heat treating. Sometimes the term tempering is used to describe this process, but that's a technically incorrect term. In modern metallurgy, tempering has a more specific meaning, which we'll explain later. Anyway, steels that are useful for cutting tools have to be hardened. The process of hardening steel involves heating that steel to a certain temperature, usually somewhere above 1450 Fahrenheit or 800 centigrade, then cooled relatively rapidly. This heat cycling causes changes in the steel at the molecular level, which make it hard enough to cut wood without getting dull in about 10 seconds. In this series, we'll use both some very simple high carbon steels and some fancier alloy steels. The important thing to understand is that each steel has its own very specific heat treating techniques. It's super important to understand that in order to maximize the quality of any given steel, you've got to do the heat treatment that's specific to that steel. In a couple cases, we'll even give some tips on how you can avoid the chore of heat treating altogether. Alright, let's jump in. The tool I'm going to make for this video is called a skew chisel. I'm starting the series with this particular tool because it's just about as bone simple a tool as you can make. So this is an approach that just about anybody can use in their shop. Now it does require heat treating, but that heat treating can be done with fairly primitive tools that a lot of folks will have in their shop. This piece of steel is known as 1095 high carbon steel. I've chosen 1095 for this first video because it's a fairly simple steel and maybe even more importantly, it's fairly easy to get hold of. This is a high carbon steel. It has roughly 99% iron and roughly 1% carbon with a pinch of manganese thrown in, which is capable of reaching quite a high level of hardness and maintaining a pretty good edge. It's a 1/4 inch thick, 1 inch wide, and around 10 inches long. I bought it from a company called Admiral Steel, which sells knife-making steels in small quantities. You can find them right here. Now, I'm going to make extensive use of an industrial quality belt grinder here and in most of these videos. Fear not. Just because you don't have this fancy grinder doesn't mean you can't do the project. You can do all the shaping I do here on a small bench grinder, or even with a good old bastard file. I'll start by grinding all the mill scale off the blade on my flat platen. That's that hard grayish black material on the outside. No good for cutting tools. If you don't have a belt grinder, you can use a wire wheel on an angle grinder or a bench grinder, flap wheel, sandpaper, whatever. It'll all work. Then I'll flatten it and true all the edges. I start with a heavy 40 grit belt and then move up through various grits to about 65 microns. Now look, You can quit whenever you want on this particular project. From a performance standpoint, the only thing that counts is the cutting edge, and so it makes no difference if you grind the rest of the blade rough or if you go nice and smooth like I did. Once I've got it squared up, I'll grind the tang and the bevels of the cutter. There's no formula for the tang, the part that fits in the handle. It's like Goldilocks, not too big, not too small. Mine's about 1/2 inch wide. I'll use layout fluid to mark the tang so that I can grind it symmetrically, but you can just as easily do this by eye. Again, you don't need a grinder. You'd be amazed at how quickly you can do this with a nice sharp bastard file. Now the cutting edge. I'm grinding the blade to a symmetrical 60-degree angle, exactly the same on both sides. Now you may have noticed that at this point this is not a skew chisel. See, the coolest thing about making your own tools is that you have total flexibility to make whatever you want. As you can see, I didn't start out making a skew, which has a slanted edge. Instead, I started out making a square-faced chisel, but ground it to its final shape as a skew after heat treatment. There wasn't any grand plan to this. I was just keeping my options open. By square grinding the faces, I reduced the amount of grinding I'd have to do after the tool is hardened, but I didn't really commit myself to a particular geometry. You could make a tool like this and then later grind it into a scraper, a skew, a round nose chisel, a round nose skew, a parting tool, whatever. I ultimately landed on a traditional skew with this project, but that wasn't baked into the cookie from the beginning. We'll see how the final grind geometry works out after the heat treating. Okay, so let's talk about heat treating 1095. What I'm going to do first is a step called normalizing, which involves heating the blade to about 1600 degrees and then air cooling it. If you skip this step, it's not the end of the world, but you'll have a more durable tool if you do it, and it's less likely to warp or to crack during the quench. A quick note about gear. My knife making friends will frequently have a nice propane forge like I'm going to use here, or a heat treating oven. Either one will work, but you don't need them. One of the themes you'll hear throughout all my videos, there's always more than one way to skin a cat. So let's say you don't have a forge. Hey, you can do this with an acetylene torch with a rosebud tip. You can probably even pull this off with a $50 MAP gas rig from Home Depot. Now, I haven't tried that, but I'll bet it'll work. The old $12 Burns-O-Matic propane rig, though, sorry, that won't hack it. You'll need more heat than that. So my forge is up to temp. I'm just going to heat the blade. An interesting feature of steel is that at around 1425 Fahrenheit, steel stops attracting magnets. That's around 800 Celsius. So I use this little magnet on a stick to gauge the temperature. $5 at Lowe's. When I'm heat treating, I like to work in a fairly dark room so I can see the colors of the steel clearly. When I'm filming, I have to do this in a brighter environment that sort of throws off your perception of the colors, but we'll just deal. So what I'm aiming to do here is to reach non-magnetic and then go up about 150 more degrees. That means I'm going from a sort of cherry red to a dull orange color. If you're doing this outside or in bright lights, the colors will look totally different, so I recommend doing this in a dark spot or at night if you can. Anyway, as soon as the blade's an even orange, I pull it out and cool it until it gets to a black heat, around 600 Fahrenheit. Normally I do this 3 times, but you get the most benefit from the first cycle, so quit there if you want. Like I say, you can do this by just brushing it with an acetylene torch flame until it gets up to temperature. Heat is heat, no matter how you get to it. Once the blade's normalized, I'm ready for hardening. Now 1095 is sort of on the borderline between an oil hardening steel and a water hardening steel, meaning that you heat it up and dunk it in water or oil to harden it, and the water cools it down quickly enough to convert it to hardened steel. Now oil cools it a little slower than water, and sometimes it may be too slow with larger pieces of 1095. So this is a pretty thick hunk of steel, so just to make sure that it fully hardens, I'm going to go ahead and water harden it with a little twist. The basic idea is simple. Heat the steel to about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit or cherry red, then cool it super fast. This will cause the steel to convert from a form known as austenite to a harder form of steel known as martensite. I'll show you how we do it. Again, you can use a torch if you want. Whether you use a torch or a forge or a heat treating oven, you want to go gentle here, bringing everything to an even heat and not overheating anything, particularly paying attention to the skinny little cutting edge. If that overheats, it's likely to crack. Now I'm going to use a two-stage quench, going into water, then into peanut oil that's been heated to about 150 degrees. Now this second step is not required, but water hardening is hard on steel and can cause warping and cracking. Oil cools a little slower than water, so it makes it a little easier on the steel. But like I say, you can just go into water, and most of the time with a simple tool like this, you'll be okay. So, now the steel's hot enough that the magnet won't stick to it, so I'll just heat it a hair more, making sure it's uniformly hot. I can gauge that by making sure that the color is even all the way across the tool. Now, I go boom, directly into hot tap water for about 3 seconds. Note, I'm only immersing it up to the end of the blade. That'll leave the tang soft and resilient. After the 3 count, I immediately transfer it to the 150 degree oil. I'm using peanut oil, but virtually any oil will work for this. I let it equilibrate in the oil for a couple minutes, then I pull it out. At this point, it should be super hard and quite brittle. I'm going to test that the hardening process actually worked by gently rubbing the corner of a file on the steel. If it sort of skates over the steel, I know that the steel has hardened properly. But if that corner kind of bites into the steel, you screwed up and you need to try again. But that's not a problem. You can repeat the hardening process several times without damaging the steel. But this looks fine. Now, at this point, your steel is too brittle to use. So we'll do a second heat treating operation known as tempering, which softens the steel slightly, toughening it so that it's less susceptible to breaking. This can actually be done in your kitchen oven. Now, I'll use a heat treating oven with a very accurate temperature control, but you don't need that. Heat your oven to around 400 degrees and temper the blade for an hour. After I take it out, I just let it sit for a couple hours, then back into the oven again at 400 degrees for a second tempering cycle. And there we have it, back to the belt grinder to clean it up. Again, if you don't have a belt grinder, no problem, just use a sanding block and wet or dry sandpaper and you can clean all the residues off. I'm using a 3M Gator Grit belt, which I like for finishing work. I'll take it up to 45 microns, which is a pretty nice finish. Now, on some of the tools, the better the finish you get, the sharper your edge will be because the body of the blade runs right up to the cutting edge. But that's not the case with this particular tool. So it really doesn't matter what your finish is on the body of the cutting tool. Here I am grinding the tool to its final profile. The skew, or diagonal slant of the blade, which gives the chisel its name, will be about 70 degrees. Then I'll grind the faces or bevels to about 25 or 30 degrees. I'm not using a jig. I just make a couple of reference marks on my table and the side of my chisel with a Sharpie. As long as I keep those marks lined up, I know that I'm working a consistent angle. I'll start with my 40 grit ceramic belt and go up all the way to a 30 micron belt, but there's no hard and fast rule here. Now bear in mind that grinding generates heat. With a big grinder like this, lots of heat. Now that the blade's heat treated, you don't want to overheat the tool, which would cause it to soften your cutting edge. If you see the edge of a carbon steel blade suddenly turn blue due to the heat that you've built up, you've gotten it too hot and ruined the edge, so you'll need to grind that part away and start over. So I use the standard knife maker's trick, which is to keep a 5-gallon bucket of water next to the grinder. When the tool starts getting hot, I just dunk it in the water. Start with a very heavy grit belt, and then ease up as you get closer to your final edge. Finer grits also overheat faster, so be very gentle after you move to those higher grits. And there we have it, the final grind. Nice and sharp. Now all we need to do is make the handle. Here's how I'll do that. So, a quick note about how I did this series of videos. I started out with 0 lathe tools. So I actually made all the blades first, then I used the cutters to make the handles. As a result, I had to jury rig a couple of handles for the first couple of tools. I did this by going to Home Depot, buying a replacement post hole digger handle, and then chopping it into 3 sections and drilling out the ends to hold the cutting tools. Very ugly, but they worked. So here's a collection of wood that I'm going to draw from as I do this project. Cocobolo, leopard wood, padauk, Osage orange, actually that one blew up, mahogany, walnut. So this is just me. This is my philosophy of wood. You can make stuff out of fairly boring woods like hickory and they'll make absolutely fine handles, but there are all these other super cool looking woods out there that honestly aren't that expensive. Since I'm doing this for the fun of it, not to make the optimally cheap yet durable tool, I'm going to make most of the handles in this project from all these exotic woods. Each tool will be a little different. I'm also going to use some seamless brass tube to make ferrules. I bought several different sizes from onlinemetals.com, but I ended up using the 1-inch OD tubing for all the handles. So, I'll go ahead and turn the handle for my chisel. I actually made these videos in a different order than I made the tools, so you'll see me using some finished tools as well as some that are still using temporary handles. You'll also see a couple of shots of me doing finish work on other handles, but I basically use the same techniques on all of them. So there's no great trick to turning a tool handle. I've owned my lathe for a grand total of about a week as I'm making these handles, so my skill level is rudimentary. Plenty of you guys are way more accomplished wood turners than I am, so take whatever I do here with a grain of salt. I'm going to turn all these handles between centers. Now there's some advantages to doing this using a chuck, but I don't have a chuck on my wood lathe, so I'm doing it this way. First, I'll rough out a cylinder using my roughing gouge. Then I'll use my parting tool to get the critical dimensions of the tool handle. I'm using digital calipers to measure those diameters. I'll have a little cylindrical nose that's about 0.93 inches in diameter, which matches the internal diameter of the ferrule. Then about 1.3 inches at the largest point, then down to 1.15 at the waist, then back up to a little over 1.2. Then another cut where we'll eventually part the piece off the excess wood at the end of the billet. Most of my later handles will be a little larger, but this will give you a general sense of the proportions that I use for all these handles. There's no real formula for this shape. It's roughly borrowed from traditional designs that companies like Sorby and Crown would use, but I'm just eyeballing it until it looks pleasing to my eye. Also, a confession about the wood that I use for this particular handle. I bought it as a scrap at a local wood supplier, and the guy at the store said that he thought it was sapele. Now that I'm into the wood, though, I think it's mahogany. But I can't say for sure since I don't know bupkis about sapele. It may look pretty similar to mahogany. Anyway, I'm using long, sweeping strokes to rough out soft arcs in the handle. I'll also use a detail gouge to profile the nose and the tail of the tool. Once I've got it roughed out, I'll sand it. Because I use zillions of sanding belts for my grinder, I have lots of used belts lying around my shop that I can chop up and sand with. There's nothing particularly special about them, that's just what I've got handy. Starting with 60 grit aluminum oxide, then moving up to 120, then 220. Then I'm using this cool plastic-backed 3M 320 grit sandpaper that I recently discovered at Home Depot. It's really neat stuff. Flexes around the work and it resists loading to a ridiculous degree. It costs more than conventional sandpaper, but I've found that I can get a ton of mileage out of it. Now, if I were using, say, hickory or ash, I'd probably quit right here, but this is a tighter grained wood, so I'll go on up to 600. Now it's time for a finish. I could wipe on some sort of oil finish and be done with it, but I think this wood will benefit from a harder finish. Now this is not really sort of the manufacturer recommended method here. I'm just kind of improvising this on the fly. This is actually a high quality spray type musical instrument lacquer, meaning that it dries ridiculously quickly. It's totally not intended to be applied this way, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'll just put some on a paper towel, spread it as quickly as possible on the lathe at the lowest speed, and the second I've got a full coat, I quit. If I don't, it'll get gummy and stick to things and it'll just look awful. Now, understand about nitrocellulose lacquer, it's kind of nasty stuff. It's a neurotoxin and the fumes are poisonous and so on, so I'm wearing a high quality respirator and latex gloves. I'll put on about 6 or 8 coats. Each time doing the same thing, just laying it on super quickly and letting it dry. Then I'll hit it with some 1000 grit sandpaper. Lightly, just enough to even the surface. And then when I'm at the final coat, I'll go ahead and buff it. Normally nitrocellulose lacquer should be allowed to harden for, a couple weeks before it gets totally cured. But honestly, I don't really care that much about making this perfect, so I'll let it cure a day or two and then buff it out using automotive polish and a paper towel. Still, not bad for a hack job. So let me just make a general note about finishes. I'm going to use a wide variety of different kinds of finishes here. All of them have their positives and negatives, and I'm not really advocating for any different one. Different finishes work great on some woods and terrible on others, so try them out, see which ones you like, and that's the one to go with. When it comes to driving the hole for the tang of the chisel, the best way to do it is to use a chuck and a steady rest once the piece is roughed out. But let's say you don't have a steady rest or a chuck, which I don't. Here's another approach. We'll make a jig or drill guide which fits over the ferrule of the tool. One piece of excess hickory, clamp it in my drill clamp, clamp the vise to the drill table. Now since the ferrule is 1 inch in diameter, I'll drill a 1-inch seating hole with a spade bit, then a 1/2 inch guide hole centered in that hole. Simple setup. Very important that the work doesn't move between the drilling of the seating hole and the guide hole. Otherwise, your jig will simply repeat your mistake time after time after time, which defeats the whole purpose of a jig. Now, the jig fits right over the ferrule, and you can use a hand drill, a drill press, or whatever to drill a nice concentric hole. In my case, I clamp the jig on my drill press so it's square and stable. Then I just hold on to the handle itself and drill right in. Once the hole's drilled, I'll grind a little excess steel off the tang of the tool so that I get a nice friction fit into the handle. Then I'll give it a little extra security by seating it with epoxy. Note that I'll also insert tiny wedges on both sides of the tang to give it a little extra grip. Now I screwed up when taking this shot and messed up the video, so I'll show the glue up of another handle, but the principle is exactly the same. A little bit of final cleanup to get all the squeeze out. And the tool's ready for action. Alright, let's just say all this heat treating stuff seems like too much hassle. Does that mean I can't make my own tools? Nope. Join me for Project 2, a spindle gouge. Heat treating not required. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my website, waltersorelsblades.com, where you can find more of my work. You'll also find plenty more videos there that you can't find on YouTube with very, very detailed information about all aspects of Japanese blade making. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorels Blades.